She was just 8, homeless, forgotten, surviving on scraps. But that night when Bella heard a baby crying near a millionaire's grave, everything changed. She chose to save him. For a moment, she felt strong, like maybe she had control. But when strangers began hunting for a baby with 2 colored eyes, her world turned upside down. A photo hidden in his blanket, a secret worth millions, and a powerful family willing to bury the truth again. What did Bella really find that night? Want to know what happened? Watch till the end for a story full of emotions and shocking twists, and tell us, what city are you watching from? Comment below and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. Bella didn't remember exactly when the streets became her home. Maybe it was after the shelter turned her away, or after that kind lady at the bus stop gave her a sandwich and disappeared forever. 8 years old, small for her age, and 2, quiet to be noticed, Bella learned how to move like a shadow, how to sit still so long people forgot she was there, how to listen to the wind and read the hunger in her belly like it was just another part of life. But the cemetery, that place felt different. It wasn't just quiet, it was peaceful. Among the moss-covered headstones and whispering trees, Bella felt invisible in a way that didn't hurt. No one yelled there. No one asked questions. No one tried to take anything from her. The cold was sharper, yes, but the silence, it was kind. She started sleeping under the tall oak near the back, where the fence was broken and the ground felt soft. She used a trash bag as a blanket some nights, and when it rained she curled up against the roots of the tree and imagined she was in someone's arms. She never cried. Not anymore. Crying was for children who still believed someone might hear. Then came that night. The mist was thick. It wrapped around the tombstones like a ghost's sigh, and the wind made the trees shiver. Bella was already half asleep when she heard it, faint at first, but growing louder. A cry. Not just any cry, a baby's. Her heart leapt to her throat. She sat up, blinking, unsure if she was dreaming. But it came again, weak, desperate, real. She stood, barefoot and trembling, and followed the sound. Through rows of silent graves, past flowers long wilted, toward a fresh mound of earth. And there, barely wrapped in a thin blanket, skin pale from the cold, lay a baby. Bella dropped to her knees. His face was scrunched, red from crying. His fists flailed, tiny and helpless. She reached out, hesitating only a moment, then lifted him into her arms. He stopped crying, just like that. And when his eyes opened, Bella froze. One green, one blue. They looked straight into her, not with fear, but with something else, something older than he should have known, something that whispered, "Please, stay." "It's okay," she breathed, wrapping her thin coat around him. "I've got you." She named him Joshua, and though she didn't know it yet, from that moment on, her life would never be the same. Wrapped in a coat far too thin for warmth, Bella cradled the infant against her chest, feeling his tiny heartbeat thrum, like a bird's wing beneath her fingers. The cold bit at her toes, but she barely noticed. All she could think about were those eyes, green and blue, watching her like she was something more than a shadow. She didn't know what to do next. For a long moment, she just sat there beside the grave, the fresh earth still damp, the name on the headstone looming quietly above them, Thomas Foster. The letters were carved deep, but she couldn't read the rest. School was something from another lifetime. The baby shifted in her arms and whimpered. That sound snapped her back into motion. They needed warmth, food, shelter. Things Bella had learned to find like animals found water, quietly, with instinct. She tucked Joshua into the inside of her coat and began walking, sticking to the alleyways and back streets that rarely saw light. By morning, she had stolen 2 slices of bread from a bakery's trash bin and found a spot near the train station, where the vents blew warm air. She sat cross-legged on the concrete, holding Joshua close, humming nonsense songs she barely remembered. The baby didn't cry again. He just watched her with those eyes. In the days that followed, they became a pair. Bella stopped thinking of him as something separate. He was part of her now. She fed him bits of whatever she could scavenge, wrapped him tighter when the winds grew cruel, and whispered to him under bridges and behind dumpsters, telling him things she never told anyone. not even herself. Once, outside a bakery, a woman stared at them too long. "That baby," she murmured, her voice strange and distant. "He looks like someone I used to know." Bella turned her face away and walked faster. Later that evening, as the city lights flickered in puddles and car horns howled like distant wolves, a black SUV cruised by slowly. Its windows were tinted. The man behind the wheel didn't glance at her, but he was asking around, asking about a baby, one with two colored eyes. Fear curled up inside Bella's chest. That night, she didn't sleep. Instead, she counted the baby's breaths one by one and promised him silently, "No one's taking you, not while I'm breathing." The city never stopped moving, but Bella had learned how to disappear inside it. With Joshua held close, she slipped through shadows and steam, keeping her head down and her ears open. The SUV came back twice, never fast, never loud, just drifting like it was hunting without teeth. It wasn't until the third night, beneath the rusted bridge where the trains groaned overhead, that she found the secret. Joshua was fussing, twisting, in his blanket. Bella adjusted it gently, trying to soothe him, when her fingers caught something, a hard edge sewn into the seam. Curious, she turned the blanket over and carefully pulled at the stitches with a rusted hairpin. Inside, folded tight and hidden like treasure, was a photograph. It showed a man holding a newborn, the child swaddled in the same blanket now wrapped around Joshua. The man's eyes, one green, one blue, stared straight into the camera. There was something in his face Bella didn't have a name for. Sadness, maybe. Or hope. On the back, written in smudged ink, were just a few words. "If anything happens to me, protect him. He is my son." Bella didn't fully understand what it meant, but she understood enough. This baby didn't end up in that cemetery by accident. Someone had tried to erase him. Someone wanted him forgotten. And suddenly she wasn't just scared. She was angry. Every instinct she had, the ones that kept her alive in doorways and dumpsters, turned sharp and alert. Whoever had left Joshua there had also left behind a warning. Or a clue. And maybe, just maybe, a chance. Still, food was growing harder to find and Bella's strength was wearing thin. Her ribs ached from hunger. Joshua's cries were softer now. That frightened her more than any SUV. Desperation pushed her toward a place she usually avoided, a food pantry she'd heard about from other kids. It was run by older people, the kind who asked too many questions. But she had no choice. Joshua needed help. When she walked through the doors, a warm hand gently touched her arm. "Sweetheart," a voice said softly, "you shouldn't be out in this cold." Bella looked up into the kindest eyes she'd seen in years. The woman's name was Laurie, and the moment she saw Joshua, she went pale. Laurie didn't speak at first. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for Joshua, not to take him, just to touch his tiny hand, to be sure he was real. Bella stood frozen, unsure whether to run or trust. Trust was a luxury she hadn't afforded herself in a long time. Then Laurie whispered, "Those eyes. Only the Fosters have them." Bella blinked. The name meant nothing to her. But the weight in Laurie's voice said otherwise. She followed the woman through the pantry's narrow hallway, Joshua still pressed against her chest. Inside a small office that smelled of cinnamon and paper, Laurie handed her a blanket, a sandwich, and a cup of tea warm enough to sting her fingers. Bella didn't speak. She just stared. Finally, she pulled the photograph from her pocket and slid it across the table. Laurie's breath caught. She covered her mouth. "That's Thomas," she said. "That's his baby." The room went still. Even the old clock on the wall seemed to pause. Laurie leaned back slowly, as if the weight of memory pulled at her bones. "I worked for the Foster family for over 20 years. I held Thomas when he was just a boy. I watched him grow into a man who never quite fit in with his father's world." She spoke softly, like every word was being unburied. According to Laurie, Thomas Foster had fallen in love with a woman named Eleanor, a brilliant researcher working in his father's pharmaceutical company. When she became pregnant, Thomas was ecstatic. But he also discovered something else, reports of people getting sick, dying, during unapproved drug trials buried deep within the company's data. He confronted his father, Walter Foster, a man known more for power than mercy. Thomas planned to go public. He never got the chance. The crash was ruled an accident. Eleanor vanished. And the Foster family made one quiet, devastating claim. Thomas had no heir. Laurie's voice broke. I always thought it was a lie. That maybe somewhere there was a baby. But I never expected this. Bella looked down at Joshua, now sleeping peacefully. For the first time in weeks, her hands stopped shaking. Laurie stood up, walked over, and placed a gentle hand on Bella's shoulder. You're not alone anymore, she said. You brought him to the right place. Laurie didn't ask too many questions. She didn't press Bella for details or try to take Joshua from her arms. Instead, she offered warmth, a bed in the spare room, soft towels, soup that smelled like memory. Bella had never known kindness without strings. It left her quiet, watchful, but not running. That night, as rain tapped gently against the windows, Bella sat in the dark beside the crib Laurie had dug out of the attic. Joshua slept deeply, his mismatched eyes closed in peace. The room smelled of lavender and old wood, and for the first time in what felt like years, Bella's eyelids grew heavy without fear. In the morning, Laurie poured 2 cups of tea and sat across from her at the kitchen table. There was no rush in her voice, just steadiness like the ticking clock above the sink. I don't think it's safe yet, she said quietly. Someone out there still wants to keep this quiet. Bella nodded. The man from the SUV hadn't returned, but his silence was louder than his presence. Laurie pulled out a worn file box from the closet, laying its contents across the table. Photos, old letters, bits of news clippings. She had saved everything from her years with the Fosters, not out of loyalty, but out of suspicion. One clipping showed Thomas Foster shaking hands with a senator, another his father Walter standing beside a company banner, Foster Biomedical, saving lives, 1 pill at a time. The slogan now felt like a cruel joke. There were rumors, Laurie murmured. Thomas told me once, right before he died, that if anything happened to him, there'd be proof. He was going to leave it somewhere no one would think to look. Bella leaned in. Like a hiding place. Laurie nodded. He mentioned a storage unit once, something under a different name, said it had everything. Hope flickered, small but persistent. Before they could plan further, a knock came at the door. 3 sharp taps. Then silence. Laurie moved to the window and peeked through the curtain. A man in a grey suit stood on the porch, holding a badge. Child Protective Services, he called out, but something was off, too polished, too rehearsed. Laurie didn't open the door. Instead, she turned back to Bella and whispered, "Pack what you need, now." They didn't take the front door. Laurie led Bella and Joshua through the back alley behind the house, the same path the garbage cans rolled down on pickup days. She moved fast, with purpose, but kept her voice low and calm. Bella clutched Joshua tightly, trying not to let him feel how hard her heart was pounding. They rode a bus across town, then another. Laurie spoke little, only nodding to herself now and then as if confirming directions stored in her memory. By late afternoon, they arrived at a run-down storage facility on the city's edge. The gate groaned as it opened. The number on the unit matched the one Laurie remembered, 36C. She inserted the key with shaking hands. Inside, the air was thick with dust and forgotten time. There wasn't much, just a few boxes, an old backpack, and a tarp covering what looked like an old crib. But it wasn't the crib that mattered. It was the backpack. Bella found it half buried under a sheet. The zipper stuck, but she yanked it free and opened it on the floor. Inside, diapers, a bottle, a change of baby clothes, and a small USB drive taped to the lining. There was a label written in red ink. Truth. They stared at it in silence. Back at Laurie's, once they were sure no one had followed them, she plugged it into her old laptop. A video file loaded instantly. Thomas appeared on the screen wearing a plain shirt, dark circles under his eyes. He looked tired, but his voice was steady. "If you're seeing this, I'm gone. My father will lie. He'll say my son never existed, but I won't let him erase us, not again." The video cut to files, photos, medical records, emails, names of people who had died in drug trials the company covered up. And in the middle of it all, a photo of a newborn, Joshua, his birth certificate, his fingerprints, his DNA, Bella's. Hands trembled as she watched. There it was, The truth no one wanted out, and now it was theirs to carry. Laurie closed the laptop slowly. This changes everything. Bella looked down at Joshua, now awake in her arms. No, she said softly. This is everything. The next morning began with a decision. They couldn't keep the truth hidden. Not anymore. Laurie made a call to an old contact, a journalist named Evelyn Hart, someone she trusted from years ago when whispers about Foster Biomedical first began surfacing. Within hours, Evelyn was at Laurie's table, her recorder set gently between the teacups, listening in stunned silence as Bella recounted everything, every cry, every grave, every breathless night hiding in the dark. When Evelyn saw the photo of Thomas holding Joshua, her hands went still. When she watched the video on the USB drive, her eyes filled with tears. "I'll publish it," she said, "but you need to be ready. Once this goes out, it won't just be whispers anymore. It'll be war." Laurie nodded. Bella didn't speak. She didn't have to. The story hit the news the next morning, not as a whisper, as thunder. Secret heir to pharma empire. Found, bombshell evidence ties, Foster Biomedical to illegal trials. The headlines spread like fire. News vans crowded streets. Reporters shouted into cameras. The nation watched as the legacy of Walter Foster began to crack. And then came the test. Walter, silent at first, issued a cold statement denying all accusations. But pressure mounted. Journalists demanded answers. Shareholders panicked. Finally, Walter Foster appeared before the press, aged, sharp-suited, and visibly rattled. "I will submit to a DNA test," he declared, "and if this child is truly my grandson, I will acknowledge him." The results arrived 3 days later. Positive. The truth couldn't be buried anymore. But when Walter agreed to a private meeting with Joshua, he expected a crib. A nanny, a staged moment to fix his reputation. What he found instead was a girl, thin, dirty, standing barefoot on his marble floor, holding his grandson like a shield, her eyes locked on his, defiant, quiet, unshaken. "I protected him," she said simply, "when no one else would." Walter looked into the mismatched eyes of the baby in her arms, his own eyes, and for the first time in decades, something inside him shifted, fragile, painful, real. He didn't speak, he only nodded. Beginning, perhaps, not forgiveness, but something close. Time moved differently after that day. The world didn't go quiet. If anything, the noise only grew. Reporters knocked, lawyers argued, protests formed outside Foster Biomedical headquarters. But in the small house with peeling paint and soft blankets, something rare took root. Peace. Walter Foster didn't try to take Joshua away. He came back, first with hesitation, then with something softer. Books, warm sweaters, stories from a past Bella had never known. He never asked her to call him anything. He never pushed. But he showed up again and again, until his presence felt less like intrusion and more like something steady. It was Bella who built the rhythm. She helped Laurie hang new curtains. She made soup the way Laurie taught her, humming to Joshua as he clapped along. Every night before bed, she checked the lock on the door twice. Old habits didn't fade quickly. But now they were just echoes, not chains. Joshua started to giggle more. He called Bella Sissy. He teethed on Walter's expensive watch and drooled on his jacket, and the old man never complained. In fact, he laughed, really laughed, for the first time in years. One afternoon, Walter brought something wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a gold frame. The photograph it held wasn't formal. It wasn't staged. It was just the three of them, Bella with tangled hair, Joshua in her arms, Walter kneeling beside them, smiling despite himself. It was messy, imperfect, and it was theirs. "I thought you might want to keep it," he said, and left it by the door. Bella placed it next to her most prized possession, the worn photo of her grandmother. Sometimes late at night she would stare at both, past and present side by side, and let herself believe what she never had before, that she belonged, that she mattered. Laurie called it a miracle. But Bella never asked for miracles. All she ever wanted was to protect a baby who cried alone in the dark. She did that. And in doing so, she found something she thought was lost forever. Not safety, not comfort, family, Because blood might build a name, but only love builds a home. 3 months later, in a quiet courthouse that smelled of old wood and fresh paper, a judge looked over the documents with raised brows. "Walter Foster," he said, glancing up. "You're petitioning for dual adoption of the child Joshua and the minor Bella?" Walter stood straighter than he had in years. "Yes, Your Honor." Bella's hands were cold in her lap. She didn't speak, didn't blink, not until the judge looked directly at her. "You understand what this means, young lady? You'd be legally part of the Foster family. His name, his guardianship, his responsibility." Bella nodded, then whispered, "He's already been all that." Joshua let out a sleepy gurgle from her arms, like punctuation. The judge smiled gently, signed the forms and said, "Then let it be written." Outside, reporters waited, but for once, Walter didn't stop for them. He walked Bella and Joshua down the steps slowly, sunlight filtering through the trees. When they reached the sidewalk, he turned to her and said, "You don't have to call me anything different." Bella looked up, searching his face. "I think I will," she replied. "What would that be?" She paused. "Grandpa." Walter blinked hard, cleared his throat, and nodded once. Firm. They got ice cream that afternoon. Bella ordered vanilla with chocolate chips. Joshua smeared strawberry across his cheeks. Walter spilled a little on his tie. No one cared. Later that night, back in their new home, where framed photos now filled the once-empty mantel, Bella placed the adoption papers next to her grandmother's picture. 2 families, 2 beginnings, 1 heart. And in the silence that followed, she whispered a promise. Not to run, not to hide, but to grow, to stay. Because no matter how the story started, this was how it would be remembered. Not as a girl who had nothing, but as the girl who saved everything. If this story touched your heart even a little, we'd be honored to have you as part of our community. Hit that subscribe button and stay with us for more stories that remind us of what truly matters: kindness, courage, and the family we choose. Thank you for watching.